1791 to 1803. Drakenbrod was somehow different from the nameless shtetl that used to exist in the same place. Business went on as usual. The uprisers still hollered, hung and limbed, and still looked down on the slouchers, who twiddled the fringes at the ends of their shirt sleeves, and still ate cookies and quiches after, but more often during services. Grieving Shanda still grieved for her deceased philosopher husband Pinchas, who still played an active role in shtetl politics. Yankel still tried to do right, still told himself again and again that he wasn't sad, and still always ended up sad. The synagogue still rolled, still trying to land itself on the shtetl's wandering Jewish human fault line. Sofiavka was as mad as ever, still masturbating a handful, still binding himself in string, using his body to remember his body, and still remembering only the string. But with the name came a new self-consciousness, which often revealed itself in shameful ways. The women of the shtetl raised their impressive noses to my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. They called her Dirty River Girl and Water Baby under their breath, while they were too superstitious ever to reveal to her the truth of her history. They saw to it that she had no friends her own age, telling their children that she was not as much fun as the fun she had, or as kind as her kind deeds, and that she associated only with Yankel and any man of the shtetl who was brave enough to risk being seen by his wife, of which there were quite a few. Even the surest gentleman stumbled over himself in his presence. After only 10 years of life, she was already the most desired creature in the shtetl, and her reputation had spread like rivulets into the neighboring villages. I've imagined her many times. She's a bit short, even for her age, not short in the endearing childish way, but as a malnourished child might be short. The same is true for how skinny she is. Every night before putting her to sleep, Yankel counts her ribs, as if one might have disappeared in the course of the day and become the seed and soil for some new companion to steal her away from him. She eats well enough and is healthy insofar as she's never sick, but her body looks like that of a chronically sick girl, a girl squeezed in some biological vice, or a starving girl, a skin and bones girl, a girl who is not entirely free. Her hair is thick and black, her lips are thin and bright and white. How else could it be? Much to Yankel's dismay, Rod insisted on cutting that thick black hair herself. It's not ladylike, he said. You look like a little boy when it's so short. Don't be a fool, she told him. But doesn't it bother you? Of course it bothers me when you're a fool. Your hair, he said. I think it's very pretty. Can it be pretty if no one thinks it's pretty? I think it's pretty. If you're the only one, that's pretty. And what about the boys? Don't you want them to think you're pretty? I wouldn't want a boy to think I was pretty unless he was the kind of boy who thought I was pretty. I think it's pretty, he said. I think it's very beautiful. Say it again and I'll grow it long. I know, he laughed, kissing her forehead as he pinched her ears between his fingers. Her learning to sew from a book Yankel brought back from the Vav coincided with her refusal to wear any clothes that she did not make for herself, and when he bought her a book about animal physiology, she held the pictures to his face and said, Don't you think it's strange, Yankel, how we eat them? I've never eaten a picture. The animals, don't you find that strange? I can't believe I never found it strange before. It's like your name, how you don't notice it for so long, but when you finally do, you can't help but say it over and over, and wonder why you never thought it was strange that you should have that name, and that everyone has been calling you that name for your whole life. Yankel, Yankel, Yankel. Nothing so strange for me. I won't eat them, at least not until it doesn't seem strange to me. Brad resisted everything, gave in to no one, would not be challenged or not challenged. I don't think you're stubborn, Yankel told her one afternoon when she accusation lit the men's intrigue, but it was her clever manipulations, her coy gestures and pivots of phrase, her refusal to acknowledge or ignore their existence that made them follow her through the streets, gaze at her from their windows, dream of her, not their wives, not even themselves, at night. Yes, Yaska, the men in the flour mill are so strong and brave. Yes, Fievel, yes, I am a good girl. Yes, Saul, yes, yes, I love sweets. Yes, oh yes, Itzik, oh yes. Yankel didn't have the heart to tell her that he was not her father, that she was the float queen of Dragomday, not only because she was, without question, the most loved young girl in the shtetl, but because it was her real father at the bottom of the river with her name, her papa the hardy Mendo Foer. So he created more stories, wild stories with undomesticated imagery and flamboyant characters. He invented stories so fantastic that she had to believe. Of course, she was only a child, still removing the dust from her first death. What else could she do? And he was already accumulating the dust of his second death. What else could he do? With the help of the shtetl's desirous men and hateful women, my very great-grandmother grew into herself, cultivating private interests, weaving, gardening, reading anything she could get her hands on, which was just about anything in Yankel's prodigious library, a room filled from floor to ceiling with books, which would one day serve as Drakenbrad's first public library. Not only was she the smartest citizen in Drakenbrad, called upon to solve the difficult problems of mathematics or logic, the holy word, the well-regarded rabbi once asked her in the dark, which is it, Brad? She was also the most lonely and sad. She was a genius of sadness, immersing herself in it, separating its numerous strands, appreciating its subtle nuances. She was a prism through which sadness could be divided into its infinite spectrum. Are you sad, Yankel? She asked one morning over breakfast. Of course, he said, beating melon slices into her mouth with a shaking spoon. Why? Because you are talking instead of eating your breakfast. Were you sad before that? Of course. Why? Because you were eating then instead of talking, and I became sad when I don't hear your voice. When you watch people dance, does that make you sad? Of course. It also makes me sad. Why do you think it does that? He kissed her on the forehead, put his hand under her chin. You really must eat, he said. It's getting late. Do you think Bitzel is a particularly sad person? I don't know. What about grieving Shanda? Oh yes, she's particularly sad. That's an obvious one, isn't it? Is Shloim sad? Who knows? The twins? Maybe. It's none of our business. Is God sad? He would have to exist to be sad, wouldn't he? I know, she said, giving his shoulder a little slap. That's why I was asking, so I might finally know if you believed. Well, let me leave it at this. If God does exist, he would have a great deal to be sad about. And if he doesn't exist, then that too would make him quite sad, I imagine. So to answer your question, God must be sad. Yankel. She wrapped her arms around his neck as if trying to pull herself into him, or him into her. Brad discovered 613 sadnesses, each perfectly unique, each a singular emotion, no more similar to any other sadness than to anger, ecstasy, guilt, or frustration. Mirror sadness. Sadness of domesticated birds. Sadness of being sad in front of one's parent. Humor sadness. Sadness of love without release. She was like a drowning person, flailing, reaching for anything that might save her. Her life was an urgent, desperate struggle to justify her life. She learned impossibly difficult songs on her violin, songs outside of what she thought she could know, and would each time come crying to Yankel, I have learned to play this one too. It's so terrible. I let's write something that not even I can play. She spent evenings with the art books Yankel had bought for her in Lutsk, and each morning sulked over breakfast. They were good and fine, but not beautiful. No, not if I'm being honest with myself. They are only the best of what exists. She spent an afternoon staring at their front door. Waiting for someone, Yankel asked, "What color is this?" He stood very close to the door, letting the end of his nose touch the peephole. He licked the wood and choked. "It certainly tastes like red." "Yes, it is red, isn't it?" "Seems so." She buried her head in her hands. But couldn't it be just a bit more red? Brad's life was a slow realization that the world was not for her, and that for whatever reason, she would never be happy and honest at the same time. She felt as if she were brimming, always producing and hoarding more love inside her. But there was no release. Table, ivory elephant charm, rainbow, onion, hairdo, mollusk, Shabbos, violets, cuticle, melodrama, ditch, honey, doily. None of it moved her. She addressed her world honestly, searching for something deserving of the volumes of love she knew she had within her, but to each she would have to say, "I don't love you." Bark brown fence post, "I don't love you." Bone too long, "I don't love you." Lunch in a bowl, "I don't love you." Physics, the idea of you, the laws of you, "I don't love you." Nothing felt like anything more than what it actually was. Everything was just a thing, mired completely in its thingness. If we were to open to a random page in her journal, which she must have kept and kept with her at all times, not fearing that it would be lost or discovered and read, but that she would one day stumble upon that thing which was finally worth writing about and remembering, only to find that she had no place to write it, we would find some rendering of the following sentiment: "I am not in love." So she had to satisfy herself with the idea of love, loving the loving of things whose existence she didn't care about at all. Love itself became the object of her love. She loved herself in love. She loved loving love, as love loves loving, and was able in that way to reconcile herself with the world that fell so short of what she would have hoped for. It was not the world that was the great and saving lie, but her willingness to make it beautiful and fair, to live a once-removed life in a world once removed from the one in which everyone seemed to exist. The boys, young men, men and elderly of the shtetl would sit vigil outside her window at all hours of the day and night, asking if they could assist her with her studies, with which she needed no help, of course, with which they couldn't possibly help her even if she let them try, or in the garden, which grew as if charmed, which bloomed red tulips and roses, orange and restless impatience, or if perhaps Rod would like to go for a stroll on the river, to which she was perfectly able to stroll on her own, thank you. She never said no, and never said yes, but pulled, slackened, pulled her strings of control. "Pull. What would be nicest," she would say, "is if I had a tall glass of iced tea." What happened next? The men raced to get one for her. The first to return might get a peck on the forehead, slacken, or pull, a promised walk to be granted at a later date, or slacken, a simple "thank you, goodbye." She maintained a careful balance by her window, never allowing the men to come too close, never allowing them to stray too far. She needed them desperately, not only for the favors, not only for the things they could get for Yankel and her that Yankel couldn't afford, but because they were a few more fingers to plug the dike that held back what she knew to be true. She didn't love life. There was no convincing reason to live. Yankel was already 72 years old when the wagon went into the river, his house more ready for a funeral than a birth. Brad read under the muted canary light of oil lamp sometimes covered with lace shawls, and bathed in a tub lined with sandpaper to prevent slipping. He tutored her in literature and simple mathematics until she had far surpassed his knowledge, laughed with her even when there was nothing funny, read to her before watching her fall asleep, and was the only person she could consider a friend. She acquired his uneven walk, spoke with his old man's inflections, even rubbed at a 5 o'clock shadow that was never, at any time of the day of her life, there. I brought you some books in lust, he told her, shutting the door in the early evening and the rest of the world. We can't afford these, she said, taking the heavy bag. I'll have to return them tomorrow. But we can't afford not to have them. Which can we not afford more, having them or not having them? As I see it, we lose either way. My way, we lose with the books. You're ridiculous, Yankel. I know, he said, because I also bought you a compass for my architect friend and several books of French poetry. But I don't speak French. What could be a better occasion to learn? Having a French language textbook. Ah, yes, I knew there was a reason I bought this, he said, removing a thick brown book from the bottom of the bag. You're impossible, Yankel. I'm possibly possible. Thank you, she said, and kissed him on the forehead, which was the only place she had ever been kissed, and would have been, if not for all the novels she had read, the only place she thought people ever kissed. She had to secretly return so many of the things that Yankel bought for her. He never noticed because he couldn't remember ever having bought them. It was Brad's idea to make their personal library a public one and to charge a small fee to take out books. It was with this money, along with what she was able to secure from the men who loved her, that they were able to survive. Yankel made every effort to prevent Brad from feeling like a stranger, from being aware of their age difference and their genders. He would leave the door open when he urinated, always sitting down, always wiping himself after, and would sometimes spill water on his pants and say, "Look, it also happens to me," unaware that it was Brad who spilled water on her pants to comfort him. When Brad fell from the swing in the park, Yankel scraped his own knees against the sandpaper floor of the bathtub and said, "I too have fallen." When she started to grow breasts, he pulled up his shirt to reveal his old dropped chest and said, "It's not only you." This was the world in which she grew and he aged. They made for themselves a sanctuary from Trek and Broad, a habitat completely unlike the rest of the world. No hateful words were ever spoken and no hands raised. More than that, no angry words were ever spoken and nothing was denied. But more than that, no unloving words were ever spoken and everything was held up as another small piece of proof that it can be this way. It doesn't have to be that way. If there is no love in the world, we will make a new world, and we will give it heavy walls. We will furnish it with soft red interiors from the inside out, and give it a knocker that resonates like a diamond falling to a jeweler's felt, so that we should never hear it. Love me, because love doesn't exist, and I have tried everything that does. But my very great and lonely grandmother didn't love Yankel, not in the simple and impossible sense of the word. In reality, she hardly knew him, and he hardly knew her. They knew intimately the aspects of themselves in the other, but never the other. Could Yankel have guessed what Brad dreamed of? Could Brad have guessed? Could she have cared to guess where Yankel traveled at night? They were strangers, like my grandmother and me. But each was the closest thing to a deserving recipient of love that the other would find, so they gave each other all of it. He scraped his knee and said, "I too have fallen." She spilled water on her pants so he wouldn't feel alone. He gave her that bead. She wore it. And when Yankel said he would die for Brad, he certainly meant it, but that thing he would die for was not Brad exactly, but his love for her. And when she said, "Father, I love you," she was neither naive nor dishonest, but the opposite. She was wise and truthful enough to lie. They reciprocated the great and saving lie that our love for things is greater than our love for things, willfully playing the parts they wrote for themselves, willfully creating and believing fictions necessary for life. She was 12, and he was at least 84. Even if he were to live to 90, he reasoned she would only be 18. And he knew he would not live to 90. He was secretly weak and secretly in pain. Who would take care of her when he died? Who would sing to her and continue to tickle her back in the particular way she liked, long after she'd fallen asleep? How would she learn of her real father? How could he be sure that she would be safe from daily violence, unintentional and intentional violence? How could he be sure that she would never change? He did everything he could to impede his rapid deterioration. He tried to eat a good meal even when he wasn't hungry, and drink a bit of vodka between meals, even when he felt it would tie his stomach into a knot. He took long walks each afternoon, knowing that the pain in his legs was a good pain, and chopped one piece of wood every morning, knowing that it was not in sickness that his arms ached, but health. Fearing his frequent deficiencies of memory, he began writing fragments of his life story on his bedroom ceiling with one of Broad's lipsticks that he found wrapped in a sock in her desk drawer. This way his life would be the first thing he would see when he awoke each morning, and the last thing before going to sleep each night. You used to be married, but she left you above his bureau. You ate green vegetables at the far end of the ceiling. You are a sloucher, where the ceiling met the door. You don't believe in an afterlife, written in a circle around the hanging lamp. He never wanted Brad to know how much like a sheet of glass his mind had become, how it would steam with confusion, how thoughts skated off it, how he couldn't understand so many of the things she told him, how he often forgot his name, and like a small part of him dying, even hers. 812. The dream of living forever with Brad. I have this dream every night, even when I can't remember it the next morning. I know it was there, like the depression a lover's head leaves on the pillow next to you after she's left. I dream not of growing old with her, but of never growing old, either of us. She never leaves me, and I never leave her. It's true, I am afraid of dying. I am afraid of the world moving forward without me, of my absence going unnoticed, or worse, being some natural force propelling life on. Is it selfish? Am I such a bad person for dreaming of a world that ends when I do? I don't mean the world ending with respect to me, but every set of eyes closing with mine. Sometimes my dream of living forever with Brad is the dream of our dying together. I know there is no afterlife. I'm no fool. And I know there is no God. It's not her company I need, but to know that she won't need mine, or that she won't not need it. I imagine scenes of her without me, and I become so jealous. She will marry and have children, and touch what I could never approach. All things that should make me happy. I cannot tell her this dream, of course, but I want to so desperately. She is the only thing that matters. He read her a story in bed and listened to her interpretations, never interrupting her, not even to tell her how proud he was, how smart and beautiful she was. After kissing her good night and blessing her, he went to the kitchen, drank the few sips of vodka his stomach could handle, and blew out the lamp. He wandered down the dark hallway, following the warm glow from beneath his bedroom door. He stumbled once over a stack of Broad's books on the floor outside her room, and again over her bag. Entering his own room, he imagined that he would die in his bed that night. He imagined how Brad would find him in the morning. He imagined the position he would be in, the expression on his face. He imagined how he would feel or not feel. It's late, he thought, and I must wake up early in the morning to cook for Brad before classes. He lowered himself to the floor, did the 3 push-ups he could summon, and picked himself back up. It's late, he thought, and I must be thankful for everything I have, and reconciled with everything I have lost and not lost. I tried very hard to be a good person today, to do things as God would have wanted had he existed. Thank you for the gifts of life and Brad, he thought, and thank you, Brad, for giving me a reason to live. I am not sad. He slid under the red woolen sheets and looked directly above his head. You are Yankel. You love